In my travels along the Miramichi, I was struck by how deeply people feel a connection to the river. It's part of the history, the commerce, I'd say the very soul of New Brunswick. I heard that time and time again as I traveled the region. I was also taken by just how friendly New Brunswickers are and willing to talk about the Miramichi and the alarming decline of salmon in it. There is, I found, genuine concern for the river among people who know just how dire the situation is. Nathan Wilbur is one of those people. Nathan trained as an engineer in forestry, watershed management, and river restoration. He's an avid outdoorsman and father of one. When we talked, Nathan was vice president of regional programs with the Atlantic Salmon Federation. He's since taken on the job as president of the ASF. I spoke to him in the backyard of his home in Fredericton on a warm spring afternoon.
I am a New Brunswicker, so I grew up spending time in the Miramichi, fishing with my family, and from there grew a deep love for the river system. It's an amazing watershed. We talk about the Miramichi as one river, but really it's a whole conglomerate of many different rivers, each with their own character and quite a wide spectrum of character, from sort of low gradient, slow flowing to high gradient, clear water. And it's historically been the most productive Atlantic salmon watershed in North America. Yeah, as a New Brunswicker, I feel very close to the Miramichi, and a lot of people care deeply for the watershed, and what's happening right now with its salmon population is really hurting a lot of people.
I get a sense the Miramichi, of no other river I've seen before, really gets in people. It's really part of them.
Yeah, because the Miramichi is so vast, it's 13,500 square kilometers, it's a huge watershed, many different rivers, and a lot of public water. So many people throughout New Brunswick have camps on the Miramichi, or they're part of a family camp on the Miramichi. And so a lot of people have a connection to it. It drains about a quarter of our province, and it's centrally located, so it's sort of within reach of everybody in the province, and not just New Brunswickers, but people come from the Northeast U.S. and all over the world to come fish the Miramichi and see its beauty.
That must make it all the more difficult or even heartbreaking that salmon are collapsing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's weighing heavily on everybody.
So what's to be done? There's the big question.
What's to be done? So if we break this down, we look at root cause issues. What are some issues that salmon face on the Miramichi? So they have an incredible life cycle. They're hatched in the river. They spend 2 or 3 years in the river. Then they go all the way to Greenland and come back and spawn in the river. So along that many thousands of kilometers journey, they face so many challenges, from predation to fisheries to environmental conditions, climate change. But the Miramichi in particular, it faces one acute issue that many other salmon rivers do not face. The entire population of southern Gulf of St. Lawrence striped bass, they aggregate in the estuary of the Miramichi at precisely the time that the juvenile Atlantic salmon smolt are leaving the river. And there's a high predation that happens in that zone. And something that the Atlantic Salmon Federation, in partnership with First Nation communities and the Miramichi Salmon Association, have been doing for the last 20 years or so, since the early 2000s. We've been tracking smolt on their way out of the river using acoustic tags. And so we can see their survival at various points in the river, through the estuary, and all the way to the Strait of Belle Isle between Newfoundland and Labrador when they're heading out towards the North Atlantic. Since we've been doing that, the striped bass population has grown from about 15,000 spawners up to almost 1 million spawners in 2017. And now the spawning population is somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 striped bass. So what we've seen with our smolt tracking is that prior to that explosion of striped bass, about 70%, 55 to 70% of smolt leaving the Miramichi would get out into salt water and begin their journey to Greenland. Since the striped bass spawners have exceeded the level of about 200,000 since 2012 or so, that smolt survival has absolutely plummeted through the estuary. All the mortality happens directly when those smolt have to bypass the striped bass, and it's gone from 55 to 70% survival down to a low of less than 5% survival. So in other words, almost no smolt are getting out of the Miramichi, and as a result, they can't survive in the ocean if they don't make it there in the first place. So we've seen over a 90% decline in adult returns since 2011 on the Miramichi. So back to what's happening on the Miramichi. I mean, if we look at root cause issues, there's one acute root cause issue, and it's striped bass predation. There are other issues, of course. There's climate change, there's land use issues around forestry and development, which impacts water temperature and flows. There's all of that stuff happening too, and we're focused on solutions across the whole range of issues. So for example, we work with the New Brunswick government advocating for more landscape protections around important cold water sources and around the headwaters in the Miramichi. What that does is help buffer against climate change impacts like heavier rain events and warmer weather. So we're looking at the long term as well, and protecting mature forests and cold water features is really important for the long term.
But in the short term, you have almost a complete collapse of the species.
That's right. And so we need to do something about striped bass predation fast, and we have been working on that very hard in conjunction with First Nation communities on the Miramichi, particularly the North Shore Mi'kmaq Tribal Council and Quotum Resource Management, two Indigenous groups and work on the river, and the Miramichi Salmon Association, the New Brunswick Salmon Council, the New Brunswick Wildlife Federation. Everybody cares about this. The Miramichi Watershed Management Committee, everybody cares about this, and we've all come together to try to find solutions. And so one of the things that we've done is push very hard for the establishment of an Indigenous-led commercial striped bass fishery, which began in 2017. So DFO agreed to that as a kind of a pilot fishery, small scale. Quota is 50,000 striped bass, and that started in 2017. They didn't reach their quota until last year, so it was a learning curve. I mean, it was a learning curve for DFO as the regulator. It was a learning curve for the community to figure out how to fish them very effectively, and this tug of war back and forth with DFO to get the right amount of nets in order to catch their quota. So last year, they were finally allowed to use enough trap nets, live trap nets, to catch their quota of 50,000. In the process, like over the last few years, we also realized that 50,000 is not enough to bring down the population to a level that will make a difference for Atlantic salmon. And our overall goal with this is to improve ecosystem balance. Right now, striped bass are way up here and everything else is way down here. Not just Atlantic salmon, but brook trout, important forage fish like Gaspereau and smelt, two really important forage stocks for both salmon and striped bass, and the broader ecosystem in the Miramichi and Gulf of St. Lawrence. So all these other stocks are suffering and striped bass are thriving. So there's this imbalance in the ecosystem, and what we'd like to do through fisheries management, through DFO making some decisions around fisheries management, is to try to bring that ecosystem back into a better balance. And we think that the fastest route to that is through a Indigenous-led commercial fishery for striped bass.
how big do you think the quota has to be or should be to bring back Atlantic salmon?
All of the people and groups on the Miramichi who are trying to help the ecosystem have a better balance made a big push between 2023 2024 to increase that quota from 50,000 striped bass in the commercial fishery to something more than that. We didn't actually give a number because we don't know what the right number is. We know it needs to be more, and so DFO heard that, and they heard the request from First Nation communities, and they increased the quota from 50,000 to 175,000. We worked really hard to get that, and we know that it will take a few years to build up the fishery in such a way that they can actually catch that quota. So while that is happening, in the meantime, we've implemented, we know we need to do something more than that. Smolt are not surviving through the estuary. We need to do something. We can't wait a few years for that fishery to fully ramp up. So while that's happening, we've implemented a smolt trap and transport program. And it's a pretty basic concept. You catch the smolt before they have to go through the striped bass, and you truck them around and release them in the lower part of the estuary so they have a better chance to make it to salt water and the North Atlantic.
With truck and transport, and even if you did meet the quota, do you think it's too little too late?
It's not too little too late. And the reason I say that is because Atlantic salmon are an incredibly resilient species. They've survived ice ages, they've expanded and contracted their range, they've colonized new watersheds. They are resilient. They need cold, clean water, and in that sense that they're somewhat fragile because they need ideal conditions. But as a species, they're incredibly resilient. And the Miramichi, aside from that predation, the Miramichi is relatively healthy. Yes, it suffers from climate change. Yes, it suffers from land use issues like intensive forestry practices. But we look back to, say, 2011, there were 80,000 adult salmon in the Miramichi. There's nothing much different in the Miramichi watershed now compared to 2011, other than the smolt just aren't making it to salt water. That's the issue.
The explosion of striped bass, which ironically was in trouble itself and is a great success story in a way for DFO bringing them back.
Absolutely, and we don't want to discount that. It is a great success story, and they're a native species. They have a place in the ecosystem, and it provides a great fishery, both recreational fishery and indigenous fishery, food and commercial. It has a place in the ecosystem. We want to see all native species have healthy populations, and that includes striped bass, and it includes salmon.
Would you like to see a more intense stock program?
A more intensive stocking program, it would be an expensive striped bass feeding program, for one, but it could help bridge the gap along with the smolt trap and truck program. It could help bridge the gap between lowering the striped bass population and reducing that predation over the next few years. It could help keep juvenile densities up to help bridge the gap. So it's a controversial issue, the whole stocking thing, just because of the way the last 10 years or so has gone, and all the international science around stocking, and it's been a divisive issue in the salmon community, unfortunately. But at this point, it's dire straits on the Miramichi, and we think that using the best science, every tool in the toolbox right now should be at least considered and probably employed. Our focus in all of this is not stocking. The Miramichi Salmon Association has a hatchery. They operate that hatchery and stocking programs. Our focus, our role in all of this is to focus on the root cause issue, trying to bring down the striped bass population and truck the wild smolt around the striped bass and also focus on longer term protections across the landscape to help mitigate against climate change. And other groups like MSA they're focused on those things as well, but those are our intensive focus.
What I'm hearing from pretty much everyone is it has to be multi-agency, and you have to speak with one voice, which is tough. And you have to do all of the things you're doing in concert if these fish are even to have a chance.
Exactly. And speaking with one voice is so important. And on that front, the North Shore Mi'kmaq Tribal Council and Quotum Resource Management, they recognize that everybody needs to be unified on this. And so back in 2021, they initiated this new effort called Plamu First. Plamu is salmon in Mi'kmaq, so salmon first. Brought together all the salmon groups, government, indigenous communities, and tried to put together an approach and a plan for restoring the river and specifically salmon. And so there were conferences in 2021 and 2024, and emerging from that came a 5-year strategic plan that everybody is behind, ASF included, and the groups are united. Everybody's got a different role. Our role is focused on the trap and transport program and trying to make a difference on the striped bass commercial fishery and longer term landscape protections.
If you could wave a magic wand and make something happen, what would it be to preserve or try to preserve the stock?
Increase smolt survival through the estuary. That is the number one thing that we need to do right now. The river has juvenile salmon in it. They just can't get to the ocean. So that needs to be our intensive focus with the Trap and Truck program and working with Eel Ground First Nation commercial fishermen to give the commercial striped bass fishery the best possible chance it can get.
How do you sell that to bass fishers who don't want you to return to balance, who like the bass in the river?
Yeah, I mean, the way I would frame that up to the striped bass angling community, I mean, I fish striped bass. We all fish striped bass. It's a fantastic fishery. So it's not like us versus them. That's not the way that we look at it. We look at it as we want to see all native species in the ecosystem doing well. And right now, Atlantic salmon in particular are suffering very, very badly. Salmon are right now where striped bass were back in the late 90s when the population was down to a historic low of 3,000 to 5,000 spawners. It's gone from that to over 300,000, and Atlantic salmon right now are down at that low point, and they need care and attention from everybody. And I would hope that the striped bass angling community doesn't only care about striped bass, they care about the ecosystem and a healthy ecosystem and other native species in it. So that's how I would frame it up to the broader public, and we want to see all native species doing well.
Thank you for listening to the Saving Salmon podcast, a podcast produced by the Atlantic Salmon Federation. You can get more information and episodes on our website, www.asf.ca, or wherever you get your podcasts.